afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to give people a few minutes to get in the room before we get started. Thank you so much for joining. I think we're expecting a few more people, so we're going to wait another few seconds and then we will get started. So welcome to our second in a three-part series addressing racial injustice and social change. Today, our speaker will be Dr. Drick Boyd, and I'll give his introduction in a few minutes. First, I want to give a little bit of housekeeping as we are preparing for Dr. Boyd's presentation. This session will be recorded. It is also being live streamed on YouTube. At the same time, we have in our audience a number of faculty, staff, and students, as well as alumni. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us today. We will use the question and answer, the Q&A feature on your screen for questions. You can ask questions at any time, but we will reserve the latter portion of our conversation today for the Q&A time period. Let me go ahead and give the introduction to Dr. Drick Boyd. So Dr. Drick Boyd is an urban studies professor emeritus from Eastern University in St. David's, Pennsylvania. While at Eastern, he regularly taught courses in race and ethnic relations, social justice, urban theology, leadership, and social activism. He considers himself an activist scholar, having been involved in efforts and is a co-founder of Heeding God's Call to Prevent Gun Violence, a participant in New Conversations on Race and Ethnicity, and a member of the Education Strategy Team of Power, which is an interfaith social coalition in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and surrounding counties. Dr. Boyd is also the author of White Allies in the Struggle for Racial Justice, that's by Orbis in 2015, and Disrupting Whiteness, Talking to White People About Racism, which is Arch Street Press. It's due out later this year. Dr. Boyd is the father of 3 adult daughters and lives with his wife in Broomall, Pennsylvania. And the topic or the title of our discussion today is, what are we learning from the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery? So without further ado, Mr. Boyd, or Dr. Boyd, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. It's especially an honor to be with Dr. Smith. We were colleagues together at Eastern University, and when she was there, she was an inspiration to me and challenged me to contend with my racism and my white privilege. So I was really humbled and honored when she asked me to speak with you today. I wanted to give a little bit more background on myself. I actually grew up in the land of Lutherans, Minneapolis, Minnesota. So it feels in some ways very comfortable to talk to those of you who are part of Augustana, a Lutheran college. I actually worked one summer about 4 or 5 blocks from where George Floyd was shot. I worked at a church and was working in a youth program there. I grew up in just outside of Minneapolis and went to college at Duke University in the early 1970s, and later learned that my class was only the 6th class that had admitted African Americans to Duke University. And it was really at Duke that I first began to learn and understand about racism. If any of you have seen the film that came out a couple years ago called Best of Enemies, it's about the desegregation of the Durham, North Carolina schools, which is where Duke is in Durham. And I was there right in the midst of all of that when that was going on. I graduated from Duke and went to Boston, Massachusetts in 1975, just as they were moving into an effort to desegregate their schools through busing. And I worked with youth in a neighborhood that was about 1/3 African-American, third Puerto Rican, and third Irish Catholic white, all poor, and really began to understand racism on a personal level, on an experiential level, being in the midst of that situation. I actually was a pastor for 16 years in the American Baptist churches, and one of my churches was probably 200 or 300 miles up the Mississippi River from where your school is, in Winona, Minnesota. And it's interesting, in Winona, about 80% of the church-going population in that town were either Catholic or Lutheran. So those of us who were Baptists were all by ourselves. I started at Eastern University in 1997, and I taught there for 22 years. I just retired this past September. And one of the books that Dr. Smith mentioned I wrote was White Allies in the Struggle for Racial Justice. And that really came out of a class that I taught every year on race and ethnic relations, and where it was usually a pretty well mixed race group. And I always had an exercise where we did what we call caucusing, where I put all the African-American students in a group, all the Hispanic students in a group, and all the white students in a group. And I would give them an assignment. Usually it was something like, come back and talk to us about your culture and what you're proud about your culture. And so when the Black folks came back, they talked about their food and about their music. And when the Latinx folks came back, they talked about many of the things they appreciated about their culture. When the white folks came back, this one time, they said we looked at each other for 20 minutes and we didn't know what to say because we're just so struggling with the weight of racism. And it was out of that conversation, I said, you all need some role models. And so that book, White Allies, is 17 stories of 18 white people through US history who sought to be allies in the struggle for racial justice through our history. And it was really out of that experience that I began to see that part of my calling, if you will, part of my research really has got to be directed at helping white folks come to terms with what racism is and how we deal with it. And so the most recent book that I've been working on, Disrupting Whiteness, really tries to address that. And some of the things I'm going to share today come out of that book that I've been working on. I will say up front that working on my own racism and trying to understand the impact of racism on those of us who are white is something that I've been working at for 40 years. And I by no means see myself as an expert, but as someone who's on a journey. And as I begin, I really need to acknowledge something right up front, and that is that I am a recovering racist. Let me say that again, that I am a recovering racist. What I mean by that is I'm the product of a family, a community, and a national culture that has led me to believe that my experience as a middle-class, white, heterosexual male is basically the same experience of all persons, regardless of race, or gender, or class, or sexual orientation. I was raised to believe that the success I had in life was due to my intelligence and my hard work. I grew up believing that the education system, that the criminal justice system, that the government and other institutions in our society, while not perfect, basically operated in a fair and impartial manner when it came to race. And so I believe that whatever I achieved and what I learned was result of my playing by the rules and working hard. What I didn't realize was the game was rigged in my favor. I was socialized to believe that I was a little bit smarter, a little bit more resilient, a little bit better than many others. And the fact that most of the people who were kind of at the same place I was were white wasn't due to our race, it was just due to our effort. Racism was bred into me from the day I was born by loving parents, by caring teachers, by mentors and coaches and other role models without my knowing, and in many cases, perhaps without their knowing. Like a child born into a drug-infested environment, I was bound to become addicted to the drug of white supremacy. And I am. And much of my personal journey toward an anti-racist lifestyle has involved unlearning and my privilege and unlearning my limited worldview and relearning a new way of seeing and living and being in the world. Now, as I call myself a racist, I would call myself a recovering racist. And those of you who are familiar with the 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous know that when people complete the 12 steps, they never say they are recovered. They always say they are recovering. Because the genius of the 12-step movement is that it recognizes that one is never free of addiction, but instead must continually work on their recovery. Because the minute they begin to think that they've gotten over it, that they've been cured, they begin to slide back into their addiction. And in the same way, I've learned that though I've grown a great deal and learned a great deal in regard to my own racism and how it operates in the world, I've been reminded more times than I care to count that I still have work to do. So that every time I teach a class or lead a discussion or carry on a talk like we're doing today, I purposely turn the light on myself before I look at others and say anything to others. So what I want to share with you are things that I have grappled with myself, and I do so realizing that I have a lot of growing to do, and hopefully in the Q&A we can interact with one another in that way. So the events of the last several weeks have presented us with all sorts of challenges. I don't know what's happening in your part of the world, but in Philadelphia, just about every day for the last 5 weeks, there have been marches and demonstrations, sometimes several at different places at the same time. And there is great ferment right now in our country around issues of race and issues of police and other institutions in our society. And so it's led me to this question of what's going on and what are we going to do about it? And in the 1970s, Marvin Gaye, the soul singer, Motown soul singer, had a song called What's Going On? And I'd like to share with you a video with that song as a background with images that come from Flint and other places in our country where racism in its most vile form has become so evident. And with that question that Marvin Gaye asks, what is going on? See if I can get this to go. That video was made last year sometime about events that have been going on for the last 4 or 5 years, but could have been made yesterday in many ways. The video says nothing about George Floyd, but it has everything to do with the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Michael Brown and Rayshard Brooks and Eric Garner and Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin, and on and on and on we could go. It says nothing about inadequate schools or lack of health care or lack of living wage jobs or the Jim Crow criminal justice system, but it has everything to do with them. What connects all of these people and the issues and inequities that this song talks about and the video talks about is systemic racism. And that's what we want to talk about today, is what is systemic racism and how do we begin to address it and recognize it? But before I jump right into it, I do want to try and define some terms. So I want to talk a little bit about some terms like racism, systemic racism, white supremacy, and white privilege to help us get a common language about what we're talking about, because these words are used in a lot of different ways. And so I'm going to use my slides for that as well. So, oops. So, racism. Racism is, in America, is a white problem. The African-American author Richard Wright moved to France after World War II. He was just tired of contending with racism at every turn. And many African-American artists went to France. They found it a little more accepting. And one day he was asked by a French reporter to comment on the Negro problem in America. And Wright responded by saying, there isn't a Negro problem in America. It's only a white problem. And so I think the first thing I want to say about racism is that it's not a Black or brown or Asian or Latino or Native American problem. It's a white problem. And so it's white folks who need to take the lead in working on it and fixing it. All those others are ones who are hurt by our unwillingness to really confront the systemic racism in our society. I also would say that racism is a condition, not an accusation. What do I mean by that? Well, racism is one of those things that a lot of people don't like to be called, and they don't like to talk about. I mean, to be called a racist for many people is one of the most hurtful and damaging things one can say. We see it as an accusation. We see it as a criticism of our character, a challenge to our faith and our moral decency. And there's no doubt that people use the word that way. But I want to suggest that racism is first and foremost not an accusation, but it's a description of our condition as whites in America. It's an integral part of our culture and our socialization and our family life and our daily life. It's why I began this talk by saying, I am a racist. I'm a recovering racist. It's part of our condition as white people. Also, we tend to think of racism in very individualistic terms, kind of, how people interact with one another, what they say or do in relationship to each other. And certainly that's a dimension of racism. But racism also is a system. It's a way of thinking and acting and seeing the world. And so my definition of racism is what we have up here. Racism is a political, economic, and cultural system that consistently advantages one group over another on the basis of their racial identification. It's a system that has shaped us as a nation so that we see one another through a lens of advantage and disadvantage, of worth and lack of worth, of being fully human and being less than human. And so if we are to really deal with racism, we really have to come to terms with that this is something that has been bred into us, that we've been socialized into, and we need to begin to unlearn and undo that which was bred into us. And that's why I say racism is a condition rather than an accusation. It's part of who we are. And coming to terms with that is really a big part of how we begin to undo this system. Now, when we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about a system.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Boyd. Are you intending to share your slides with us?
Yeah, can you not see them?
I cannot.
Oh,
I assume that others cannot either. After the video, we weren't able to see your slides.
All right, sorry about that. Okay, let me get you. Sorry about that. All right. All right, is that better?
That works. It's not in presentation mode, but we can see it. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. So when we come to systemic racism, we're really looking at the interrelationship of various institutions in the society that work together to create racially discriminatory policies and practices, which in essence become the norm. We don't really recognize them because it's just the way things are. So when we talk about the criminal justice system works the way it does because it was designed to work that way. And the fact that it disproportionately incarcerates men and women of color is just the way it is. We don't really question that. And we see that in housing segregation. We see it in bank policies around mortgage lending and how people of color have a much harder time getting a mortgage. We see it in voter suppression going on right now in many states, and gerrymandering, making it difficult for people of color to vote. And we see it in police practices. Systemic racism is just the way, it creates an environment where that is just the way things are. And it's sort of this picture of the iceberg. We tend to think of racism as something that's very overt and right there in front of your face, but that's really only the tip of the iceberg. That systemic racism is really sort of encompasses all our institutions and all our ways of being with each other. And as we go about our daily lives, that we just come to see it as the way it is. And yet for people of color, it's a constant challenge because every day they face it in terms of hiring policies and the way people interact with them, with microaggressions, whether they are treated as fully involved in a group, if they're treated with respect. All of those things impact them in a way those of us who are white often don't see, because it's just as we see it, just the way it is. And this system is informed by an ideology we refer to as white supremacy. Now, white supremacy oftentimes think of people in white hoods burning crosses, or we think of angry young men walking through the University of Virginia with tiki torches, shouting blood and soil and other things like that. And certainly those are extreme forms of white supremacy. But white supremacy is really an ideology that informs our systems, that was really born out of our history. And so there was in our history this inherent belief in the superiority of Europeans over against non-whites. And it was used to justify all sorts of crimes against indigenous peoples and African slaves who were brought here as slaves. And it rationalized racial disparities, whether it was in wealth or in health or well-being. And it justifies the fact that white men particularly occupy most of the leadership positions in powerful institutions. And it's so ingrained in our society, we don't quite know how we would change it. And sometimes we don't even notice it. And what that then does for those of us who are white is it creates a system where we have what is called white privilege. And white privilege is, again, one of these terms that often offends people because they realize, hey, I work hard. I got where I am because of what I did and the effort I put into it. And white privilege doesn't deny that. But what it suggests, what the concept of white privilege suggests, is that simply because people are white in this society, there are certain advantages that they are granted and certain access to resources that they are granted that is often denied or limited to people of color. And it often expresses itself in very, very mundane and simple things like a lot of white people are kind of confused about all this hubbub about the police because for white people, police don't often hassle you just for being white, for just being around. White people aren't followed around when they go in a store and suspected of shoplifting. Whites come to expect that they will have decent schools, access to healthcare, nutritious food, and so on. Things that, when we really look at it, are not always available in communities of color. And so all of these things, systemic racism, white supremacy, white privilege, create a system that has built-in inequities. And unless we identify those inequities and where people are being denied access to resources and opportunities where others are available to whites, we will have an unjust system, an unfair system, a system that will continually discriminate, even if we ourselves as individuals are very well-meaning and very, very caring and very forthright in support of racial equity. The system itself creates the inequities that we ourselves are abiding by without really knowing it. And so when I say racism or white privilege it's a condition we're in, not an accusation. It's just the way things are. It's a description of the status that we find ourselves. And so The effect of this is it creates situations like we saw on the evening of Memorial Day, May 25th, on a corner in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis police officer. The system was designed for that to happen. Black and brown people in Minneapolis have complained for years of being hassled by the police, of being harassed by the police, and even beaten by the police unjustly. This was not the first time that happened in Minneapolis. But not only does it happen in Minneapolis, but it happened in Ferguson, and it happened in Orlando, and it happened in Minneapolis, and it happens in New York, and it happens in towns and cities everywhere, because there's something built into the system that disproportionately harasses and hurts people of color in a way that those of us who are white will hardly ever see. Al Sharpton at the funeral of George Floyd, I thought really said it well. He said, when Officer Derek Chauvin put his knee on the neck of George Floyd, he put his knee on the neck of every Black and brown person in America. When people saw that video of George Floyd having his very breath pushed out of him, they identified with him in a way because they too had experienced that kind of violence, that kind of dehumanization that they saw in that video. And so what we have seen over the past 4 or 5 weeks is people basically saying, enough, enough. We've had it, things have got to change. And it's hard. It's hard. Every day, people of color go about their days living with the stress and burden of white supremacy and racism that they experience every day. I read a blog recently by an African-American young man, and it simply was entitled, "I am Black and I am tired." And it began this way. He says, "You'll never understand how tired I am, how tiring it is to be Black and alive, how tiring it is just to have the strength to move. Black injustice after injustice and just carry on. How mentally, physically, existentially, and physically draining it is. The word tired doesn't even come close to encompassing the feeling." And you know, I have a number of African-American friends who have said very similar things over these past few weeks. They say, I'm tired. I'm tired of always feeling angry. I'm tired of getting passed over or dismissed. I'm tired of being in a group or being in a class and being singled out as a spokesperson for my race. I'm tired of facing the subtle but real microaggressions that I face every day. And I'm tired of seeing a video of another Black person beaten and gunned down by police and nothing happening to call them to justice. White supremacy is causing this young man and many others like him to just be weary and worn down by every institution in our society. And if all we see is people marching in the streets, or maybe we see some looting or burning here or there, we're missing the point. Martin Luther King said that violence of this sort are the cries of the unheard, the cries of the unseen. And so it is time, I think, for us as a nation, where we're finally seeing what is going on and asking the question, what should we do? You know, Dr. Calinthia Dowdy, who is also a former colleague of Dr. Smith and I from Eastern University, recently wrote an article about something called disruption theory. And she said, disruption theory teaches us that people only change when there's a disturbance or a break. And she goes on to say that then when there is a disturbance such as we are having now, it is a time for us to really take stock of ourselves and our institutions and say, what needs to change and how can we change? And so even though this, for many of us, is a very troubling time, and a very confusing time, it also is a great opportunity to look at ourselves as institutions and systems and as a nation, and even as a college, and say, what do we do now? How do we move from here? I suspect at Augustana, when school starts, if and when school starts in the fall, there are going to be a lot of people coming back saying, what are we going to do? What's on our mind? And this is a great opportunity for all of us, wherever we are, to ask these important questions. So I have a couple thoughts, and then I just want to, I'll stop and we'll open it up for further discussion. One of the things, in addition, what I'm hearing in a lot of the protests, I'm hearing two things, two messages. One is defund the police, defund the police. And if we want to talk about what that is, I'll be glad to engage that in the Q&A time. But the other thing that I hear a lot, and I've been in a number of Zoom sessions like this where we've been talking, is I've been hearing particularly Hispanic and Black leaders saying, you white people, you need to deal with your white supremacy and your racism. And you know, there's a lot of, one of the things that's very interesting about this time is that unlike previous times with the civil rights marches in our recent time, these have been very diverse, both in terms of race and age. And so it's a very different time. And it'd be easy for us to think, okay, so yeah, we're all in this together. And so we don't have to deal with our racism. But what these leaders are saying is, no, it's much deeper. It's much, much deeper than taking part in a march or a protest. You really got to go deep and look at how racism has impacted your life. And so I want to just share with you an exercise that I often do have often used in my classes and I use in workshops that gets at what I call understanding your race story. And this exercise is something you can do as a journal exercise, you can do it as sort of a small group, but it's something that's designed to simply get us thinking about, from the very beginning of our lives, how was racism impacting us? And so, as you see, the questions are very simple. At what age did you first become aware of the idea of race? When did you hear about that? And when did you first encounter a person of another race? And the reason these first two questions are so important is our society is probably more segregated today than it was in 1954 when the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education case came about. We live segregated lives, separate lives in our churches, in our communities, in our social gatherings. So it's not unlikely that it might be a few years before you first encounter a person of another race. Then the third question I think is really important. What are some of the messages that you receive from the adults in your life about people of other races? What are the symbols you saw? What are the books you saw them reading? The TV shows they talked about? What were the messages that you were absorbing as a young person, as the adults around you were talking? And when did you first experience or witness racial discrimination? And what were you thinking? What were you feeling? What was that like? Was it scary? Was it exciting? Was it shocking? What were you experiencing? And then this fifth one is sort of an ongoing question of, what are the critical incidents in your life over the course of your life where you've encountered something that either revealed your racism or opened your eyes to racism in a new way? These questions are the kind of questions we need to be continually asking ourselves. And on the critical incidents, it's important for us to realize, even though we may have read some books, we may have been to some seminars, we've been to workshops, we may have taught courses on it, that we still have lots to learn and to grow. And I remember very powerfully, it was actually 2007, in the winter of 2007, I was invited to take part in a workshop, a community workshop, entitled Bridging the Gaps of Race and Class for Social Justice. And so it was a group of about 15 to 20 people from a variety of walks of life. I would think I was the only college professor. There were bus drivers, there were maids, there were mothers, there were pastors, there were students. And we met for 5 weeks talking about issues of race and class and how we overcome these. And in the middle, about the third session, I will never forget, about a 40-year-old African-American woman. She was a bus driver. looked at me right in the eye and she says, "You are so arrogant and you are so unwilling to listen." And I was totally unaware of what I was doing in that setting. And what was shocking is, first I was, really taken back by her statement, but then what really sunk in is that no one stood up to defend me, but backed her. And here I was, a professor, I taught all these courses, I knew all these books, and yet I still had to come to terms with the way I was presenting myself in such a way that I diminished other people simply because they didn't have my degree or they were not of my race or my gender. And so critical incidents are really important for us to be aware and to stay awake to the fact that racism is so deeply embedded in us that even when we don't intend to, even when we intend to think we're doing the right thing, we can often come across in ways that are very destructive to other people. And so looking at these critical incidents in our lives and the messages that we are conveying and are being conveyed to us will help us to become aware of this ongoing process of learning how racism works in our lives and unlearning the practices so that we can do something different. So that would be one of the first things that I would suggest we do, is we come to terms with how racism is impacting us. And once we do that, then we begin to see things that we didn't see before, and we begin to hear things that we didn't hear before, because our eyes have been opened and our ears have been opened to a new way of thinking, a new way of looking. The second thing I would offer is a way to try to understand how systems work. Systems, when a system creates a certain outcome, it's because that system has been designed to create that outcome. So when a college graduates a certain number of students at the end of a 4-year term, it's because that college was designed to do that. And if a college didn't do that, then it would not be fulfilling its function. Well, when it comes to racism in systems, systems create racist outcomes because they are designed that way. And it's only when we begin to understand how that is happening that we can begin to change them. There's a professor at Morehouse College, the Morehouse School of Medicine. Her name is Dr. Kamara Phyllis Jones. And she uses the metaphor of a dead fish. And she tells a story. If you were by a lake, you were at this lake and you went to the shore and you saw a dead fish, you'd be very concerned. But if you continue to look and you saw more and more dead fish, that would be even more alarming. And then if you heard that in other lakes around this same region, there were lots of dead fish, this would be even more a reason for concern. The dead fish are a sign that something is wrong in the water. Unfortunately, in our society, very often, when things go wrong, we blame the fish. We blame them because they didn't eat right. They didn't work hard enough. They didn't apply themselves. We assume there's nothing wrong with the lake or the water. As a society, we say it's the fault of the fish because we're very individualistic. We're very much based on merit. And so if the fish die, well, that's their fault. That's not the system's fault. But a systems approach says, wait a minute, what killed the fish? Why are these fish having trouble surviving? Why are these fish having trouble thriving? And eventually we get to asking a question about what's in the water that fills these lakes. Is it the groundwater? Is it acid rain? Is it the streams that feed these lakes? The dead fish are not the problem. They are a sign that a problem exists. And in the same way, when we talk about systems, we need to look for the signs that the system isn't working as well for all. We need to ask ourselves, as we do right now during this pandemic, what is it in our healthcare system that is making it so disproportionately people of color are contracting the COVID-19 disease and getting sick and dying. What's wrong with the healthcare system? We need to ask ourselves why schools that exist in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods are broken down, are filled with asbestos and lead. And that these students, even though they graduate, have a hard time getting into our universities. I recently read a story about a young Black woman who was valedictorian of her high school. And she said, I was valedictorian of my high school, but when I got to college, I had to take remedial math. Is that her fault? Or is that a fault of the system that in a public school, a student can't even get the basics of math, even though she's the valedictorian? What is it in our systems that is creating these dead fish, and how can we address them? When we talk about the police are a system and part of a culture that has persistently dehumanized Black and brown people. And I understand last week you had an excellent presentation that really gave you the whole historical narrative of how that came to be. In our city, Black and brown people are disproportionately stopped and frisked for no reason at all. They're subject to unwarranted searches and stops. They're subject to unwarranted violence, particularly against young people. And they are often singled out as the reason for certain problems in the city, and rather than seeing their condition as something wrong with the system that has created their circumstances. Now, when we come to talking about systems questions, this is not something that we do as individuals or even as individual institutions. As Dr. Smith mentioned, I've been part of an organization called POWER. POWER stands for Philadelphians Organized to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild. And it's an organization of about 60 faith communities that have come together to address issues of inequity in the school funding, in the workplace, in healthcare, and in environmental racism. And we are working together not only as an organization with each other, but with many other organizations to try and change the laws and the policies and the practices in our city and state that are disproportionately impacting poor Black and brown folks in our city. So system change is something that really requires coordination, and it also requires a long-term commitment. Because unfortunately, systems don't change, usually don't change willingly. Frederick Douglass put it well. In fact, I have it on my door that people in power don't give up power willingly. We have to demand change. We have to demand power. So given the immensity of the reality of racism in every institution in our society, the task of dismantling systemic racism in our society may seem next to impossible. But I'll always like to go back to a quote that is attributed, I think, to Nelson Mandela, where he said, "Something is only impossible until you prove it's not." And regardless of our race or background, we all need racism to be abolished. While people of color experience the ravages of racism most directly, I believe white people are crippled deeply by racism as well. So it's all in all of our self-interest and the self-interest of our nation to do this work. And I thank you for the opportunity to share, and I look forward to the dialogue that we can have now as we continue to grapple with these really, really important and complex issues. So thank you.
Dr. Boyd, thank you so much for that very informative, very enlightening talk that you gave to us. Very, very grateful. Questions are starting to come in. So I'm going to get right to some of the questions that we have, and I've got a few of my own. We're looking forward to your answers to these questions. So our first question comes from a faculty member. And the question is, while trying to be fair, nonpartisan, and conciliatory towards all groups, how can we hope to get more and more people to accept our common humanity when the political leadership refuses to acknowledge the inequalities in the system, but rather fans the divisive and superioristic rhetoric?
Simple question. Yeah, I think the particular political climate that we find ourselves in is very creates great barriers to this kind of meaningful dialogue across our differences. And while a lot of attention gets to be placed on the right, particularly on our president, I think there are voices on the left that are equally divisive. And so I really think that we need to, first of all, acknowledge that it's not just one side that's creating the problem, but we can easily get drawn into it. So I think one of the things that has helped me into sort of thinking about this is that I can only affect those within my sphere of influence. And so it's really important that first and foremost, as I tried to talk, really deal with my own stuff. And then as I interact with whether it's students or their faculty or just people in general, that I'm trying to build bridges of mutual respect. It's amazing to me how a little bit of care and respect goes a long way. But I will say one thing, and I don't know the race or gender of this faculty member, but I'll speak as a white male. Very often, as a white male, I need to recognize that my very presence, particularly in an interracial or multiple gender situation, often represents something that is seen as sometimes very dangerous and abusive to other people. And so I have often had to align myself and put myself under the leadership and guidance of people of color to really guide me through that process and let me know where I can contribute. Because, a lot of people's reality is how they perceive things. And even though I may see myself as very caring and opening and inclusive, if others don't see me that way, I have to accept the fact that I, in a sense, have to earn their trust by, in some ways, submitting myself to them and earning their trust. Because our society, people who look like me, have done a lot of damage, and I just need to own that and recognize that that's part of the reality that I live with.
Thank you for that. So you started your talk with your own journey, right? That you realized that some of the assumptions you made, right, were at the very root in terms of your definition racist, right? The assumptions that you made about how you were able to navigate life without thinking about other people's experiences and making assumptions about those experiences and how they must have been at least equitable. And then at one point you talked about how the system is designed to work in very much the way that, the situation that happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the overreach that happens in Black and Brown communities. You said it was designed to work like that. And I actually said, ouch, that was a painful moment for me. But my question, Dr. Boyd, is this: do you think that non-Hispanic whites are somehow conditioned to be insensitive to these issues? So my issue, I keep thinking, or I see on social media, people will say, I've been followed through a store, I've been this, and they talk about the Black experience. And somebody will retort, I'm a biker and I have those same experiences. It's not a Black-white thing, right? Where does this level of, for lack of a better word, insensitivity, lack of acknowledgement of the experience, is that a particular conditioning you think that happens in this system that you've identified as racism?
I do. I think generally speaking, whites in this society are socialized to think in very individualistic and meritorious terms. So as a white person, I don't think of myself as a part of a group called whites. I'm just Drick Boyd, this person. And part of the system, part of the way the system works is it really emphasizes that, this whole idea of individual achievement, individual merit. Well, when you're part of a group that's continually discriminated against, you are, in a sense, you get together and say, oh yeah, that happened to me too. And all of a sudden you realize that this is a group experience. And I think for whites, it is very hard. I think there's two things going on. One is, I think it's very hard for whites to think in group terms, that our experience as whites is whatever it is. I think the other thing that's often going on there is the discomfort of recognizing, oh, there might be racism there. And so I will deflect it by telling my one experience where I was followed in the store because I had a bike outfit on. Yeah, I probably have been followed in the store at some time in my life, but it's not something I'm always looking over my shoulder. I'm really struck by stories where I hear parents saying they, at age 10 or something, Black parents will give their kids to talk, which has nothing to do with sex, which is, in the white community, that's all about sex, right? The talk is about sex. But in the Black family, it's often about how you respond, when you're stopped by a police officer. Not if you're stopped, but when you're stopped. When you go into a store and you buy something, make sure you ask for a bag and a receipt and you carry them out. Now, those are things I was never taught. Have I walked out without a receipt? Yeah. But I didn't have to worry about it. So I think it's very hard for whites to think in collective terms because we're so socialized to think individually. And part of the challenge, I think, in undoing racism in the way we think about it is begin to realize that there are certain patterns that affect us as whites that are pretty common across all different stratas of white society.
Fantastic. Can you recommend some other authors who have worked on being allies? And this also says, thank you for your talk. Other authors or that you could tell us about who worked on being allies?
Certainly being allies, I got to say, the term allies is a very controversial term in this sense that when a white person will tell me, I want to be an ally. I said, well, that's great. Just don't go broadcasting it, right? Because Lila Watson, who is an Australian Aboriginal activist, said, if you've come here to help me, don't bother. But if you've come because your destiny is tied up with mine, then let us work together. And so the true ally is someone who has seen that the well-being of those who are oppressed are part of their well-being too, even though they themselves may not come from an oppressed background. I think actually Ibram Kendi in his book on anti-racism has a chapter on allies, which I think is really good. There is a organization, it sounds like a white supremacist group, but it actually isn't. It's called it's the Center for the Study of White Culture in Rosemont, New Jersey. It's based in New Jersey. And they do a lot on white allies and then an organization that puts on an annual conference, and actually it's based in the Midwest. I think it's based in St. Louis. It's the White Privilege Conference. And they do a lot of good work around allyship. And I've been to a couple of their conferences and they're very good. So those would be, off the top of my head, some that I would suggest.
Great. So I've heard the comment, Dr. Boyd, that it's not good enough to not be racist, but that people should work to be actively anti-racist. Share your opinion on that and what that might look like, because there's this whole issue, I keep contemplating this issue of self-interest, right? And, this really kind of goes to your comment that whites are conditioned or taught to see themselves as individuals. And certainly I think in our society, we champion that, right? Pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps. We champion independence, right? And all those sorts of things. but understanding the way that you've defined racism and systemic racism, it would seem that for people who don't identify as people of color, it's in your best interest to not be anti-racist, that the privilege would continue and you can be a good person, right? You don't have to actively participate in doing racist things. That's a self-interest piece. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I guess I would contend that it's probably not in your self-interest, although I can understand the logic that would lead to it. I mean, there are white supremacists who really want to grab a piece of territory and make it their white nation. But I don't think most people want to go that direction. I mean, when you talk about self-interest, first of all, as we all know, the demographics are changing, and somewhere in the 2040s, a black or brown baby is going to be born, and whites will no longer be more than 50% of the population. Now, they'll still be probably the largest plurality, but the fact is, our nation is becoming increasingly diverse. Not to mention the global platform, the global arena is extremely diverse. So it doesn't bode well for the person who's going to just simply try to stay in their little white enclave. It's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And one of the things that I think is really encouraging in these protests, as I mentioned, there are a lot of young white people out there marching. Now, they may not all know exactly what they're doing, but the fact that they're out there, I think, is really encouraging. And I know in my teaching, I taught at Eastern for 22 years and taught a social justice course for about 20 of those 22 years. And so I started with boomers, and then I had the busters, and then I had the millennials, and I even had a couple Gen Zs before I finished. And I saw the transformation in terms of racial attitudes in students coming in. You know, back in the 90s, when I mentioned white privilege, people got all uptight. And when I mentioned white privilege in 2015, white students raised their hand. Oh yeah, I know what that is. I'm okay with that. So I think these young people are seeing that it's a much better world to be able to interact with folks. And I think they're taking a lead for us. The other thing about racism in terms of the self-interest of whites is it really cripples us. I mean, I use the metaphor of addiction. I had a professor who used the metaphor of mental illness. He said, if a person has to put another person down in order to feel better, they are mentally ill and they are not healthy. And so if my well-being rests in the fact that I'm not as bad off as someone else, there's something really neurotic about that. The other thing is, while there's been a lot of talk, a lot of research recently about intergenerational trauma, and there's been some excellent work, particularly by an author named Resmaa Menakem, on intergenerational trauma with African Americans, the fact that trauma has been passed from generation to generation. But he also talks about in that book that the same thing in a different way has happened with whites who have transferred their fear. The slave masters lived in fear of the slaves because there were so many of them, and they have transferred that anxiety. And I think it explains why for so many white people, just mentioning the word race, guilt and shame just sort of fly up, because there's something in our very being that is traumatized and needs to be healed. So I really think not only on a social level, but on a deeply personal level, it makes perfect sense for one's own well-being to come to terms with whatever it was that they were taught as a child and how it has crippled them from interacting meaningfully across all kinds of differences, race being one of them.
Sure, thank you for that. There are two things, as you were giving us your answer, two quotes that came to mind for me. One was Abraham Lincoln. He's talking about the institution of slavery. He said that as he was making the decision to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, he said slavery was like holding a wolf by its ears. You are too afraid to continue to hold on and equally afraid to let go, right? It's that unknown of what do we do as times change, and that it just gets at that fear, right? That there's this enormous amount of fear if you do something, but an enormous amount of fear if you don't do something. And I think that's a really integral part of racism as we know it today, that people are afraid to do something, but also there's this fear in not doing anything at all. And that's part of a conversation we have to have. The other thought I had when you mentioned that someone used the metaphor of mental illness in talking about racism, Jane Elliott, who's well known for Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes, she identifies racism as a mental illness. And she actually goes as far as to say that the system is so rigged in favor of non-Hispanic whites that for a person to come through high school and college, or just to live in the United States as they've been living and growing in the United States, for a white person to not do well, she says that they have failed at whiteness, that they actually have failed their race by not doing well. And I thought,
Wow.
That's a powerful, painful statement. She was making the point though about how the system is rigged, and she's very just kind of in your face with the way that she says some things. But I just wanted to tie those two together. I'll go to our next question. As you know, we are a Lutheran liberal arts institution, and one of our 5 faith commitments is to social justice. I was surprised to learn that some people, including at least one board member, objected to the term social justice for sounding too partisan or too liberal. What do you think of the language of social justice beside the language of white privilege and white supremacy? Is it helpful? Are there more productive alternatives for focusing our institutional and individual vocations?
Wow.
It's loaded. Let's start with the first one. What do you think of the language of social justice beside the language of white privilege and white supremacy? Is it helpful?
Wow. I guess my reaction is it just blows my mind that social justice would be seen as a liberal concept when, the Constitution, as it was designed, it expressed that, all people are created and equal and have rights to the pursuits of happiness, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, I think the principles of social justice were built right into our founding documents. Now, they weren't always practiced, and we've spent 200 and some years trying to make that happen. I don't know. When I taught this introductory course on social justice, which I know you also taught when we were at Eastern, I would explain it. I would say, I would make a distinction between social service and social justice. And I would say social service is meeting needs directly. So that's the food pantry, that's the clothing pantry, that's providing water to people, that's giving them houses. Social justice is looking at the reasons that those needs exist. So why are people hungry? Why are people homeless? Why don't people have adequate clothing and well-being? And I guess my preference would be to try and engage people around that kind of thinking rather than turn it into some sort of political football, because justice is just basic fairness across all sectors. You're probably very familiar with the Cornel West quote that social justice is love in the public sphere. It's just what gives equity and fairness to everybody. So I guess I'm very comfortable with the term social justice but I know there are sectors politically as well as religiously who look at that word social justice as some sort of code word for radical communism or something. That's
the
not
other
where I'm
part. I'm sorry. The other part of this Are there more productive alternatives for focusing our institutional and individual vocations?
On
This was connected to the same question about social justice.
So are there different ways that we can do
Are
social
there more productive alternatives for focusing our institutional and individual vocations? The question was about this language of social justice, using it alongside white privilege and white supremacy. Are there other alternatives, I guess, in language or concepts that could be used, I guess, if social justice is a distraction, right? If the terminology is a distraction.
Well, I guess I would go to words like equity and fairness and love in the public sphere. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, but when we're talking about social justice, everybody has an equal access to the resources and the opportunities that exist. And where injustice comes in is where things like race and class and gender and whatever get in the way. I don't know your institution that well, but I mean, I know sometimes people have to work in social justice without using that word, I once pastored a church where I was told I used the word change too much. So I went to thesaurus and I used every other word besides change. So I talked about transformation and blooming and other things. Depending on your context, sometimes you have to work social justice in stealth, but I would never give up the concept, whether I use the word or not.
Fair enough, thank you. Another question. Thank you for your presentation. Large, complex, deeply rooted and aged systems are very difficult to dismantle. Typically, they are addressed in manageable steps. What steps can a single individual do to engage in dismantling deeply ingrained process of racism? What can I do?
I think you need to find some other like-minded people. I don't think we change systems, especially deeply rooted ones, on an individual basis. And I mean, maybe, if you're the president or something, you can get away with certain things, but even presidents are constrained. So I really encourage people to find other like-minded people. And, I don't know your Rock Island area or Quad City area, but I know wherever I've been, there have been a multiplicity of groups of people who are looking to make changes. And the other thing I would say about systems is that you can address the system or injustice from many different angles, and it will impact others. I often, when I have students had to do projects, they say, "Oh, I don't know if I want to do it on poverty or racism or homelessness or this or that." And I said, just pick one, because you'll interact with all the others. All these isms that we deal with are all connected, and so I would find other people and find organizations or start organizations that seek to address a very concrete change. Look for a very concrete change. You don't change like the questioner said, it's small steps. So just go for the first step. And it may seem insignificant in and of itself, but it may start a momentum that the change will come.
Yeah, and I think it was Dr. King who said you might not see the entire staircase, but you can see each step and make that step one by one.
Right. Yeah.
Move to the next question. Thank you for your excellent talk. Is there a particular activity or lesson that you've used in the classroom that has really helped to transform the thinking of students who refuse to acknowledge the role of white privilege in their lives? And secondarily, for students who fail to grasp the difference between bias and systemic racism?
Well, I think, let me answer the second one first, because I think that's simpler. I mean, bias, we all have bias, right? Bias is a prejudgment, or prejudice is against a person or against a thing that we don't know. Bias in itself, while it may be annoying, it's not terribly destructive. It's when bias is connected with the ability to impress that bias or make that bias the norm, that it becomes a problem. So I see bias and systemic racism as connected but distinct. The exercise that I have used to try and help students come to grips with privilege is something called the privilege walk, and you could just Google it. But basically you ask, everybody starts on the same line, and you ask a series of questions about people's home life, opportunities, did they have books in their house, what kind of vacations did they go to, so on and so forth. And as people answer those questions, they either step back or step forward. And at the end of 10 or 15 questions, you begin to see a distinction between those who've had certain opportunities that others have been denied. That's a very common exercise. But what's important with that exercise is not just to do it and then sit down, but then to really try and engage students in talking about what's going on here and why are some people so much further ahead down the line than others, and what's going on. And to do it, I think, with an awareness that for many people, this idea of privilege is very guilt-inducing, and very often they had no say whether they went on a vacation to Bermuda or just down the street. They grew up in a home where things were just done. And so I think it's an awareness exercise at best, and not a guilt-inducing one. And that's what I try and do when I use that exercise, is to get people to begin thinking about what does this mean. And sometimes there are surprises, sometimes the people you think are going to be the back of the line are actually in the front of the line. So it's not always as predictable as you think.
Fair enough. Do you think that exercise, Dr. Boyd, sometimes embarrasses those who find themselves at the end? And if so, how do you, who are further behind? And if so, how do you address that?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it, because that's a limitation of that exercise. And I've actually chosen not to use it for that reason sometimes if I have I've gotten to know the group a little bit. But I think, I guess I would say that if that is the case, I think, one of the things I've come to realize in more recent years is the power of story. And another thing that I will do with this kind of exercise is to get people to tell a story about why they're standing where they are, whether they're way up here, because I think, and affirm that story as just who they are. But I think you're very right. It's a very delicate issue, very delicate kind of situation to deal with. So I try to get to know my students well enough to kind of have an idea of how things will shake out before I do something like that. I wouldn't just spring it on a group.
Thank you. I particularly appreciated hearing the language you used to talk about being a recovering racist. Hearing how you and many of us are raised by loving, well-meaning parents and families who, in spite of their intentions, raised us to be racist. No question, just a thank you for that language. It's helpful as I think about my own upbringing and how I'm bringing up my own family. This is the next question about a reference that you shared with us, that someone shared with you. I'm concerned that the comparison between racism and mental illness is an ableist analogy. Can you please share your thoughts on this?
You're right. I heard that in 1980, 81, and I haven't used it, but I think, and it certainly is not meant to, in some way, stigmatize people who are struggling with mental illness. So I accept that criticism.
Then we have another question. I'm not sure how clear this will be, Dr. Boyd. So I'll ask it as the way it's written. For those of us who teach science, math, and arts, how do we address non-racist concerns in the classroom when racism is not directly related to our curriculum or subject matter?
Well, not knowing your specific discipline, and even if I did, I might not know enough about it to speak in detail. I guess I would say that my assumption going in is that racism has impacted, influenced all our disciplines in different ways. Someone talks about science, there's a great effort and some, I know at least in Philadelphia, and I'm sure in other places, to get more African Americans into the whole STEM movement. Why, what is it about that is so difficult? I don't know, but, and certainly the arts, golly, the whole protest movement is just, I don't know about you, but I've just been seeing all sorts of songs and plays and all sorts of expressions of art coming out of this. So I can't imagine that the arts wouldn't be deeply impacted. So, not knowing the discipline, I would just say, ask the question, where is racism? Is racism at work somewhere in there? And if so, how?
Yeah.
And follow where that leads.
I think the discipline are the STEMs, science and math, I think was the discipline.
I heard the word art, sorry. Yeah, but as I said, I don't know enough about it to speak intelligently, and I wouldn't try to, but I would just ask the question, is there racial discrimination that takes place in our discipline? And if so, how? And that can be at the level of curriculum, it could be at the level of faculty, it could be the level of grant dollars, whatever. So things we study.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Looking at it at perhaps exclusion as one of those areas and possible lens to look at. Sure. We're getting near the end of our time, so one final question for you. At the beginning of your talk, you discussed being a recovering racist. How, if at all, are you able to measure your journey and how well you're doing?
I don't know that I have a metric that I use. I hold myself, I make myself accountable to both white and people of color in my life, and share what's going on with me. I guess my image of recovery is that it's the journey, not the destination, that's important. So I don't look to have somehow arrived at some point in my life, but hopefully will always continue to grow. One of my heroes, if you will, is the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. And Freire talks about the unfinishedness of life, that we're always in process and that one should always be curious. And so I guess as I move through life, I realize that I'm peeling off layers of racism perhaps in my life, but there's always something deeper in there that I have to be aware of. And so it's just a matter of continuing to learn and grow and be curious and recognize that I'm always unfinished.
Fair enough. Fair enough. There's another comment. I truly appreciate the presentation and the questions from my peers. I also appreciate the idea that we can and will always be anti-racist imperfectly, just as we are human imperfectly always. Thank you. That comes from one of our faculty members. So,
amen to that.
Yeah. I don't think I need to say much after that last comment, Dr. Boyd. Thank you so much for your time sharing your information today, and certainly enlightening us and gracing us with your perspective on so many of the questions that we asked today. For those who are still on the call, I'd like to remind you of our next shared experience, and that will be the defamation experience. The defamation experience is a play. We will watch it online. You can choose from one of 3 sessions. These will be 2-part activities, and the first session will be July 1st. You will get an email later this afternoon or first thing in the morning about that. I do hope that you are enjoying these series on racial injustice and social change as we seek to stand boldly in our faith commitment of social justice. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you again to Dr. Drick Boyd from Pennsylvania. We really appreciate you being here, and have a great day. As I always say in my emails to the Augustana community, onward together we shall go. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.